Hello and good afternoon. Thanks for making it this far. This is the last session of this particular conference. We think we've got one that's really topical for the healthcare project delivery. So we're going to be talking about HPDC, which is a unique organization that we'll describe, and we're going to be talking about what's been working well, what hasn't been working well, and sort of the impact of the pandemic on HPDC. We've got a fairly good balanced group today. We've got a couple of members actually from HPDC, and then we've got an architect and an owner. So we'll get a balanced perspective on the topic. But first of all, let's do a round of quick introductions. So I'll be moderating the discussion. My name is Claudio Andretta. I'm Director of Business Development for Johnson Controls. And in the type of project delivery in healthcare, we do everything from providing all kinds of facility systems, temperature, building automation systems, fire and security systems, and we also operate buildings in an alternate delivery structure. Tom, you're next on my screen. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Claudio. I'm Tom Chesham. I'm Principal for Healthcare with Co-Architects in Los Angeles. Our three main areas of focus as architects is in healthcare and science and technology and in medical and health science education.
Hello, I'm Nancy Timmons. I'm the Chief Fire and Life Safety Officer at HPDC, and I have over 20 years of experience in the fire industry. Started off as a firefighter and then worked for the state of Michigan as a fire marshal inspector before coming over to California and working for HPDC, and then eventually becoming the Chief Fire and Life Safety Officer. Thank you for having us.
Great. Deanna?
Thanks, Claudio. My name is Deanna Navarro, and I've been with HPDC going on 15 years now. First as a senior architect and now as a plan review supervisor. In my past life, I worked in the private sector for an additional 12 years, all the while focusing on healthcare projects and leading them through varying iterations of collaborative review.
Brian?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Brian Pratt. I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Design and Construction Services and the Campus Architect at University of California, Irvine. I've been with UCI for almost 7 years, and my team is responsible for delivering the major capital projects for the campus. Prior to coming to UCI, I was working in private industry on a whole variety of project types, ranging from hospitality to healthcare to sports facilities and others.
Great, thank you. So as you can see, we've got a really balanced group. But first of all, let's talk about what HPDC is. So it's the Office of Statewide Planning, Health Planning and Development. And to give us a bit more of the roles and responsibilities and its role in healthcare capital projects, I'll turn it over to Nancy. I guess why don't you start with a discussion on what is HPDC and what does it serve? Sure.
I give a little background of HPDC. We're, as you said, Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development. We're essentially the building department for hospitals and nursing homes throughout California. And a little bit of our background, like how did we get here? Back in 1946, 47, we had a couple different agencies that were looking at the review of healthcare construction. The State Department of Health, Bureau of Hospitals had about 15 staff members at Architect, MEP, and then Office of State Fire Marshal looked at, of course, the fire review, fire plans for review. So then we fast forward. So when we got on the map a bit, it was an earthquake, February 9, 1971, the Silmar San Fernando earthquake, which is about a 6.5, 6.6. And what happened during that earthquake were hospitals collapsed. So in an event like that, where did the community go? The community's dark now without power. They're injured people. Where do these people go when the hospital's collapsing? We had one hospital that had the second floor became the first. the exit stairs all fell off the building and were lying on the ground. So clearly not a place to go after an earthquake. So that made it great awareness at that point of something needs to happen here. We got to look at these buildings more closely. So in 73, the Office of Architect and Construction started to review the structural systems for the hospitals. So that was in place for a while. A department where OSHPD was technically born started in about 78, but at that point still we're in these different agencies. So imagine taking plans to 3 separate places at this point. So a little difficulty there, as you can imagine, with consistency. So between 78 and 83, these reviews it was a trial and error, or trial, I guess I would say. We didn't know it was error at first, but where the reviews went under the locals. And with a state that has 478 cities and 58 counties, imagine the discrepancies and the inconsistencies there. So what happened after that? Another earthquake, Loma Prieta, 1989, about 6.9. And what we found was, now through all these years and changes being made and greater advancements in code and better construction, is that these facilities did do better, but because of the inconsistencies with the trial and error with the different jurisdictions, improvement was still needed. So that resulted in that earthquake resulted in a move January 1st, 1992, where the Office of State Architects, Structural Safety, and Fire Life Safety all consolidated and became a one-stop shop. So that was in 92. So to test that, in 94, there was another earthquake, Northridge earthquake. So again, through all these years, these buildings have been got better. They're not collapsed. But what did we find with that earthquake was our building stood, but the interiors didn't fare as well. So although the building was there and looked like you could go there for treatment, the insides didn't allow, if you're trying to have an operation, you can't do that if your boom's on the floor or your ceiling tile. You can't get up and down the corridors or through rooms because the ceiling's on the floor and equipment's all over the place. So what that resulted in ultimately was in 1995, SB 1953 was put into place. And that's essentially an amendment to the Alfred E. Elquist Act, Seismic Safety Act, which was in place in 1985. So in 1995, there was this amendment, and that put into place deadlines for hospitals to meet higher seismic safety standards. The first deadline was actually January 1st, 2008, that the hospitals were supposed to comply with the better seismic standards by then. As most of you are probably aware, there are several extensions since then, 2013, 2020, and now January 1st, 2030 is the extension date. So just a bit of a background on how we got to be where we are and how, the one-stop shop definitely helps with the consistency, better code writing or involved with that. So that's our life and birth and life of OSHPD so far.
Great. Thanks, Nancy. Hey, Brian, from your perspective, you're on the other side of the table, right? You're the one who has to get your projects plan checked and inspected through OSHPD. So tell me, is every project that you do have to go through OSHPD, like from, $10,000 capital projects to $100 and $10 million projects?
So it really depends on the use. University of California, each campus is their own jurisdiction, except when it comes to an OSHPD 1 facility. And so it really depends on the nature of the project and its use. We're doing a new hospital together with Tom's team and Hensel Phelps, and that has OSHPD 3 as well as OSHPD 1 in it. So it really depends on its use more than dollar amount.
Okay. And Tom, I want to bring you into Nancy talked about a consistency and standards for applicability for codes. I mean, as a designer for healthcare projects up and down the state, tell me a little bit about your experience with OSHPOD.
Well, as I was preparing for this time, I realized that I've been working with what Nancy described as the progression of OSHPOD over the years for basically the last 40 years. I started my career working with what was then in the infancy of what would become OSHPOD. And I think though I think we can describe something that has been a progression and a consolidation, there has always been a pretty good consistency with healthcare design. The codes have always been well standardized and coordinated. So as far back as I can think, it's never really been about finding in the, call it hospital realm, that there was a lot of variation going on in terms of how we went about our work. When we get into the, like OSHPOD 3, or even clinics that aren't under a licensing situation, we do see a lot of inconsistency in the application of code. And it's really the benefit of having a statewide organization that has now consolidated fire, seismic safety, and planning requirements into a single entity that we can see and across the entire state practice in a way with consistency and with interpretations that are consistent and a constant, call it updating and supplying of information about what OSHPOD has seen as best practices, even if there is an interpretive part of a code that needs to be addressed. So for us as practitioners, it becomes a very good foundation from which we can design better facilities, because we don't have to spend our time interpreting, we can spend our time improving upon that baseline.
Yeah, good.
I'd just add to that from an owner side, a theme is emerging here of consistency. There are many owners in the healthcare space that, deliver multiple projects all over the state. But there's also a cross-section of owners that, will only do one project in the next 15 or 20 years. And knowing what to expect is that owner that, for lack of a better term, maybe lacks experience in working with OSHPOD, to be able to rely on that consistency of systems and approaches is really valuable.
Yeah, that would stand to reason, right? If you're operating multiple facilities across the state, you don't want there to be different standards or different application of the interpretations. Deanna, that must go to, like, your inspectors of record, your inspectors rather, are all they've all got to be coached and trained and brought up to speed so that it's a consistent interpretation of the regulations. I mean, maybe you can speak a little bit of how the IORs are really prepared for their project up and down the state.
So in terms of IORs, let's see, I can speak more to the plan review perspective. And so the consistency really, I think, ends up in what gets approved and what the IOR then inspects, right? And so that feedback from the IORs does come back to us. And we have a building standards unit up in Sacramento that's working a lot with trying to stay on top of what the trends are and, working with entities like licensing and FGI facilities guidelines and trying to stay ahead of what the trends are. But in terms of consistency, if I could back up a bit and speak a little bit more on that, it was only, I think it was in 2009, we were 100% paper. We were 100% paper plan review organization. And one of the mandates from the Seismic Safety Act that Nancy mentioned, for us as an agency, is to be constantly researching and encouraging innovation and figuring out how to best add value. So since then, we've actually worked with Tom and co-architects, and that was in 2012. In 2012, we worked with them, and we started some of these collaborative efforts to, but unfortunately, it was still primarily paper. We started playing with Bluebeam and PDF reviews and things like that. But what over the last decade has evolved for us is a 100% electronic platform at this point. So I can't think of a better mechanism by which to sort of ensure consistency and transparency, because at this point, anybody could jump online, see what the review comments are, take a look at what the field visit reports say. It's all electronic now. And so that's really been huge for us. And at this point, actually, that's what made also the transition last year for us to going 100% telework seamless. I mean, we managed to do that overnight. And so we're very fortunate that we have these tools in place and that we finally caught up with what the industry was doing as of 2009. I think in 2009 it was like 90% of the industry's plans were being generated in CAD. So, anyways, I'm glad that we're caught up, and hopefully that speaks a bit to how we try and ensure that consistency.
Claudia, if I could just add on real quickly to the discussion about the IORs and plan review, because really the best practice here that we see our owners bringing to their projects is including the inspector of record, who is hired by the owner but licensed by OSHPD, into the project during the design phase. And that's really the bridge between what Deanna talks about in terms of plan review and having that IOR be well-versed on that project and prepared for that construction phase.
Yeah, good. You mentioned, Deanna, the electronic records. I mean, obviously, over the past 11 months, or I guess quite soon to be a year, during the pandemic, where no one's getting together, no one's meeting, no one's opening up a set of plans across the desk and working. So I guess the move to all electronic has certainly been convenient, or has certainly been a good, at least advanced thinking by OSHPD. But I'm curious, what other, how else has the COVID-19 pandemic influenced or impacted OSHPD? I'm thinking of everything from how hospitals' space might be changing somewhat to actual, temporary facilities. And Brian, I do want to get to you, but maybe first to Nancy, if you can comment on the impacts on the pandemic that you've seen, or from the pandemic.
Sure. Thank you, Claudia. We definitely have had impacts with this pandemic. Our facilities, and they had to act quick. We had to act quick. And look, the types of requests that we have seen, or have been seeing, is converting rooms from negative pressure, putting up the surge tents, repurposing spaces and rooms, suites, areas, even office areas being repurposed to treat patients, installing temporary barriers, of course, for exiting, that's automatic, for the infected side and the non-infected individuals, which those barriers did in fact affect some of the ethylene. So having to work with that, we've had issues with our demand on our bulk oxygen systems, that the demand was so great, our vaporizers were freezing, basically being covered in ice. So how do we work with that so that the oxygen is still flowing in these facilities? We had to come up with parameters. We have a guide list or a checklist on our site for COVID concerns in the facilities. One of those, of course, structurals on there for equipment, for our freezers, the freezers for the vaccines that have an A3 refrigerant, which is a flammable refrigerants like propane, butane, which aren't even allowed in hospitals. So of course we can't say you can't have these freezers, right? So working with our facilities, what can we do? Coming up with some parameters for this type of equipment. Again, the surge tents that were outside, the changes in the use of the space on the interior, that definitely had an impact. And working together with all the different agencies, the clients, the stakeholders, the licensing, Army Corps, locals, State Fire Marshal Office as well. So a lot of interrelation here, a lot of impact here with us, for us, as everybody definitely had.
So Brian, we've all seen some of the shots of temporary facilities going up. I'm curious what UCI did and managed during COVID, and sure, speed was everything, right? I mean, entire communities were getting infected, or at least it was spreading. And I'm curious how UCI managed any temporary facilities and your interaction with OSHPD on those.
Yeah, so I think the key words for healthcare facilities during COVID are agility and flexibility. The ability to adapt to a changing landscape and literal surges in patient populations. UCI at our Orange campus basically built a field hospital out in the front lawn of the acute care tower. Primarily, that's a licensing consideration more than an OSHPD one, though as it connects to utilities and such connected to the main hospital, then that's where the OSHPD factor really comes into play. So like a lot of hospitals, UCI in Orange had to really try to adapt on our toes as the surges came and surges went, and sort of the expansion and contraction of the patient care. And like Nancy points out, it really raised consideration for flexibility in terms of our future plans for our hospital. The new hospital we're building at the Irvine campus, that it really causes you pause to think about what a universal room might be, what the pressure scenarios are, what the care scenarios are, and how we can look to a future of care that is really flexible and agile and able to adapt to very quickly emerging needs.
If I could add to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, and as Brian's mentioning, what does this do with our future? And one of the tasks that we have right now, we have a task committee. What we're working on is an emergency design guide to help facilities with that. When an event like this, or an emergency event, wildfire, whatever it may be, happens, what are some, putting some guidelines in place that you may not need to change code for it. Some code may change, but if the space needs to change, but does the code need to? Maybe not. But having this guideline in place that addresses different scenarios, different concerns that the facility may have, and suggestions they may want to consider when figuring out what to do with their space in a time like that, and then examples of layouts of spaces. So that's in progress right now. We're working on that design guide, but that's something that I think can help our clients, and if something like this were to happen in the future, or again another event. So that's a helpful tool, not in place yet, but it's in progress for sure.
Yeah, and just to pile onto that quickly, sorry to interrupt, but I think for those owners that aren't building hospital after hospital after hospital, the benefit, the value of OSHPD, along with becoming a real client-facing organization, a very client-facing agency, is this best practice consideration. What can we learn from our peers and colleagues and the great experience that OSHPD sees that maybe we don't always see? What can we learn from that?
Yeah. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I've asked if there are any questions from the audience, because we're really here to make sure that you're getting out of this what you've expected. But Tom, I'll bring you in. Any changes to or improvements to OSHPD, what would you suggest?
Well, like Brian just mentioned, OSHPD represents really eyes into healthcare across the entire state. And in addition to that, involvement with Facilities Guidelines Institute and other code background sources. So I've always felt like OSHPD is a great source of best practices. Obviously, that's really not their charge, but wouldn't it be great if their charge could be expanded to at least be the collection point of, on a statewide basis, all the ideas that they see. Every medical care is a progressing thing. Codes change in a kind of slow rate. Medical care changes at a very fast rate, and we're constantly seeing the desire to do things differently. How to set up a neonatal intensive care unit, for instance. So I'm sure that those kinds of questions repeatedly come into OSHPD, or those kinds of proposals in the form of designs. It would be interesting to me to be able to at least identify the top 10 and be able to apply, bring in a research group that can help address that issue and possibly see it brought into another code cycle. And so it's a great opportunity, and I know it's not everybody has all this time to think this way, but it's if anything could really improve healthcare and improve the delivery of healthcare, it's the idea that we can all benefit from the best practices that everybody brings to the table.
So, Deanna and Nancy, without violating, you've seen all the great innovations and designs that have been going on through major capital projects in healthcare, without violating the intellectual capital that, teams and designers are bringing to the table. How can OSHPD be a repository for best practices, or how can it share best practices?
So, in a way, we're actually already doing that. It may not be perceived as such, but by virtue of having a building standards unit and being able to track alternate methods of compliance, for example, we see the new ways of providing care. And when we see an ask repeated several times, that actually does end up making its way into the regulations, because it is our building standards unit who writes those. So just as an example, acute psychiatric hospitals are what comes to mind first and foremost. The need, possibly there's a lot of conflict, I guess, in the code with regards to something that is required for for a general acute care hospital, but may pose anti-ligature risks or ligature risks for an acute psych patient population, or reduced amounts of storage, dealing with the ambulatory type of patient population. So those, we hear loud and clear what the different groups and hospitals and facilities, the direction that they're going in. I mean, somebody mentioned earlier also the universal rooms, and I mean, we've been working very closely with CDPH trying to address that need and trying to figure out a way to incorporate something that provides that type of flexibility, like what Brian was talking about earlier, but doing so in code, somehow weaving it into code.
We've got I know we're very near the end of our time. I've just got one quick a question that I think is a quick answer. Hoda from LA County Department of Public Works was asking about when these emergency guidelines would be available to the public. Nancy or Deanna, can you provide assistance with that?
I think we're in the very beginning phases of creating that. So we have several committees that are involved with that. So it might take some time. I would say maybe mid-year, maybe in the fall. I'm not sure if it'll take till the fall, but it'll take a little bit of time to gather all the information that we need and then to get it published as well. So I don't know the exact date, but I would guess mid-year to maybe the early fall.
Okay, great. And I know there's been a couple of other questions. We're at the end of our time, but we've got your information, and we will certainly get back to you with the answers. So, look, I want to thank everyone on the panel for participating and providing this kind of engaging discussion on the role of OSHPD, which may be unique in healthcare projects. But I want to thank everyone for joining the conference over the last 3 days. I would ask you to take advantage of the networking happy hour, which is starting right now, and also look for other curated conferences that the organizers are putting together with respect to P3 delivery in airports, water projects, municipal government projects, higher education. There's a number of events scattered throughout the year. So again, thanks for your time. Thanks to the panel, and I hope you've enjoyed the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.